Welcome, everyone. We are here for today's time period 4 review for the APUS exam, 1800 to 1848. And again, those of you that are here with me live, please type in your questions at any time. Answer any questions that you feel like answering as well. So here we go, 1800, 1848. We start with a general overview timeline. It begins with the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, and then his very significant purchase of Louisiana in 1803, probably the most significant purchase in American history. And then we follow that up with the War of 1812, which the conflict begins under Jefferson, but then is finished up under Madison. Then we have our short era of good feelings time period, when there was only one political party, the Democratic Republicans. That ends with the very disputed and controversial 1824 presidential election called the Corrupt Bargain. And the Corrupt Bargain leads to the end of the era of good feelings and the beginning of Andrew Jackson, since he is the person who suffered the most from the Corrupt Bargain. And then coinciding with the age of Jackson will be the Second Great Awakening, and the time period ends in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. So that's the general overview. Does anybody have any questions on the general overview, or should I continue? I think that means I should continue. Okay, so before we get started, we're going to go through each of these in depth. But before we do that, I thought there were a couple things you may want to read. This is just directly from the AP course overview. This is what is going on during this time period. The United States is developing a modern democracy and celebrating a new national culture, while Americans sought to define the nation's democratic ideals and change their society and institutions to match them. In other words, what we learned about earlier, that was British culture from the American colonists. So the idea of what it means to be an American is starting to develop during the early 1800s. Some kids are usually surprised to know that the first president born in the United States was Martin Van Buren. That's because the others were born when we were not the United States. Okay, so as far as these democratic ideals, they will expand suffrage rights. So now you don't need to just own property. Basically, all adult white men can vote. A small step in the right direction. Well, as I said, we're developing a new culture, and increasing numbers of Americans, inspired by new religious and intellectual movements, working primarily outside of the government, are trying to advance their ideals. Can I continue now so we can go through the specific timelines? I think that's a continue. Okay, so here we go. We start with the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, in his inaugural address, he said, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." He is definitely trying to unite the country at this time when political parties emerged. He believes in a more limited central government. He reduced the size of the military, and he did eliminate a number of federal jobs. Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, by the way. All right, I'm trying to go a little bit slower for the people that are going to be watching this without us. Are you guys all good? Any questions? All right, here's his Louisiana purchase, 1803. Our initial goal was to buy just New Orleans. Napoleon, in need of money, offered us the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. And this became, it more than doubled the size of the country, and it became a constitutional issue, because the Constitution does not specifically say that the president can purchase land. So Jefferson employed a loose interpretation of the Constitution, saying it doesn't say that I can't. And he used what is called the necessary and proper clause. This is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. No, you don't need to write that. And the necessary and proper clause is more commonly referred to as the elastic clause. Elastic stretches. Nice comment there, Hardeep, regarding Jefferson. Elastic stretches, and this is stretching the Constitution to meet the needs of the president. And it is frustrating for some, because Jefferson used to be a strict interpreter of the Constitution when he was opposed to the National Bank. And it'll be Lewis and Clark that would explore the region. Does anybody need me to go into any more depth on that, or can we move on to the next slide? I hope I'm going a little bit slower for some people. Please remember, you don't have to write down every single word that I say. All right, now we're going to go to the War of 1812. So the causes of the War of 1812, you have impressment. Impressment is when sailors are taken off the ships and made to work on other ships. That's cause number one. Cause number two, we had conflict with the Native Americans on the Northwest Territory. And they were probably inspired by the British to attack us. And then cause number three, there were these young congressmen, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, who wanted to expand into Canada. They were called warhawks, and they were looking to get more land. Those are your causes. And when the outbreak of the war, before the outbreak of the war, Jefferson was president. And when one of our ships was attacked, this was in the Chesapeake Leopard affair. No, you don't need to know that. Jefferson responded by saying, we're not going to trade with anyone. This was called the Embargo Act. So when Congress passed the Embargo Act, short term, this was bad for the economy. People were struggling. But long term, it made us produce more goods. Then Jefferson will say goodbye to the presidency, and James Madison comes in as president number 4. And under him, Congress passes the Non-Intercourse Act, which says that we will open up trade with everybody except for Britain and France. I'm probably getting too detailed here for a review, because then we replace that with Macon's Bill number 2, which basically reopens trade with Britain and France, but says whichever one stops attacking our ships, then we will stop trade with the other, since they were fighting with each other. I'm going to slow down. Is everybody clear on the causes of the war? And do you have any questions on that? All right, sounds good. So the major events of the war, well, the Native American attack, that was called the Battle of Tippecanoe. That's where William Henry Harrison was involved, future president, for about a month. The White House was burned down, the Star-Spangled Banner was written, and the Battle of New Orleans was actually fought after the treaty was signed, but it does make Andrew Jackson a hero. So the results of the war, this is the Treaty of Ghent, but out of all of this, what you should know are these few things here. The Federalist Party disappears, gone, and American manufacturing will increase, and nationalism will increase. For many people, this was the second time we've been able to defeat the British, although some people would consider it a draw. Do you have any questions on the results of the War of 1812? Give me some sort of acknowledgement that we're doing okay here. All right, sounds good. We're going to move on to the next slide. And that slide is this era of good feelings. I seem to have written a lot here. All right, so here we go. The era of good feelings was a phrase used by a Boston newspaper reporter who was commenting on the fact that there was only one political party, and that party was the Democratic Republicans. And were we really that cordial with each other? That's for you to decide. So now, what is happening during this time? All right, we'll start with the American culture is finally emerging. So remember, early 1800s, you'll see American artists, American writers, the American identity is being developed. Now, anything in the early 1800s, you have to think about Henry Clay, even though he was never president, had a major impact on the country. So his plan is called the American System. He wants to maintain the national bank. He wants to add a protective tariff so that we can tax foreign goods, and therefore people will be encouraged to buy American goods. And he wants internal improvements. So that's infrastructure. So it's important to know that transportation improved tremendously in the early 1800s. We start building roads, bridges, canals. We use steamships. All of this taking place at the early 1800 time period. And the debate will eventually be who should pay for it. Should it be the states or the federal government? Take a breath here. How's everybody doing? Everybody seems clear? All right, good. Just be aware that the Lowell system is that first factory where women were working and living on the grounds. So the factory system is important. I guess what I should have, maybe I did it in a different slide. No, we need to put in here, I apologize. That's what's great about being able to change it on the fly. The market revolution. Okay, change in making goods from home to factories. Important part of this time period. All right, now this might be a topic that you are not that familiar with. So, John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, there are a series of Supreme Court cases that all ruled in favor of the federal government over the state government. Yes, you are right. It's embarrassing that I forgot the market revolution. I slipped several times. I apologize. But now I'm going to test you, Hardeep. So, John Marshall's Supreme Court cases always sided with the federal government. Do you remember the Supreme Court case that said states do not have the right to tax the national bank? Because if you remember that, I'll be incredibly impressed. And I don't even know if it's going to be on the test, but the case was McCullough versus Maryland. McCullough, not sure how to spell it, versus Maryland. And I should, because I've seen it so many times. Oh, good. Check the spelling for me. I hope I have that right. And that was 1819. But any Supreme Court case with John Marshall is always siding with the federal government. All right. Adams-Onis Treaty is when the U.S. acquired Florida from Spain. And then let's make sure we know this Missouri Compromise. In 1820, there were 22 states in the country. 11 of them had slaves and 11 did not. And Missouri wants to come in, which would disrupt the balance. So what happens? They add Missouri as a slave state, and then they keep the balance by adding Maine as a free state. Maine was part of Massachusetts at the time. And then for future territories, they divide the land at the line 36 degrees, 30 minutes. Anything above that line, future territory would be free, and below that line would be slave. And everybody good? Alyssa, everything going all right over there? All right. And then we will end this with 1823. The U.S. issues the Monroe Doctrine, which says we tell Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. They're no longer welcome here. If they had colonies already, they can keep them. But if not, no new territories, no new colonies are allowed. But remember, we weren't necessarily strong enough at that time to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. All right, that's a lot for the era of good feelings. Do you have any questions? All right, we move on to the next one. Okay, so just remember, Henry Clay was Speaker of the House. Henry Clay was a very prominent congressman. He was from Kentucky. I believe he was in the House of Representatives. I believe he was in the Senate. He ran for president 3 times, lost all 3 times. But his greatest relevance is as a legislator who focused on internal improvements, infrastructure, cared deeply about building up roads and bridges, and thought it was very important for the future of the United States. Is that a good enough answer for you? All right, sounds good. Yes, Hardeep, he was part of the corrupt bargain, which happens to be the next slide. And here we go. In 1824, 4 people are running for president. Again, this is a review, so I don't want to get too bogged down in it. But those are your electoral college vote totals, and by most people's math, 99 is the largest number. Unfortunately, the electoral college system says you have to have a majority, and 99 is not a majority of that total. So the Constitution says that the House of Representatives will select the president. And the House was led by, as I just told you, Henry Clay. And by the way, it's from the top 3, so Henry Clay gets crossed out. And the House selected John Quincy Adams. Some people think there was a secret deal between Clay and Adams. That Clay said, I'll help you get elected if you make me your Secretary of State. That was the position people wanted at the time to become president. And Henry Clay did become Secretary of State, but he never became president. So what happens? This gets Jackson very upset. he creates his own party and say goodbye to the era of good feelings. Do you have any questions on that at all? I do love teaching that very much, but at the same time, I realize that we have to move on. Any questions? All right. And by the way, your parties, it will be the Democrats, which is Jackson, versus the Whigs, which is Clay. That will be your second two-party system. And I know a lot of people, I know, here we go. I was waiting for the question. Who are the Whigs? Okay, so the Whigs are similar to the Federalists. The Whigs believe in the national bank and they believe in federal government having more power. And yes, I do have to teach this in more depth, and I promise that I will. As a matter of fact, maybe we will just do that in class tomorrow. How's that sound? Sound good? All right, I promise I will. All right. It's a little bit ironic that you feel like I haven't taught the Whigs enough since I've spent so much time on Henry Clay. I guess I should have identified him as a Whig. All right, so now let's go to the age of Jackson. All right, so what is happening? Number one, increase in democracy. So Jackson, and I hope you all understand this. It is not Jackson who increases democracy. It's while Jackson is president, there is a greater emphasis on democratic principles. So now they will have a convention to nominate who runs for president. The people were involved in that. More people are able to vote. They get rid of the property qualifications. Now, Jackson used something called the spoils system, which said he gets to put people into positions in the government. Some people think that's favoritism. Other people think that that's greater democracy because we're getting more people involved in the process. But just know that there is this idea of Jacksonian democracy. We did that cartoon in class, but Andrew Jackson used the veto more than the first 6 presidents combined. The Peggy Eaton affair. I am not spending time on the Peggy Eaton affair. I apologize. I did that in class. I'll make this a 15-second explanation. Peggy Eaton created tension between John C. Calhoun and Andrew Jackson. And ultimately, John C. Calhoun was the vice president, and that's going to lead to him resigning and going down back to South Carolina, causing trouble. You want the other slide? You want this slide? Is that the one you want? Go ahead, take that picture, I guess. Are you done taking the picture? All right, good. So the Peggy Eaton affair leads to tension between Jackson and Calhoun, and it's over the tariff. Jackson demands that the South pay the tariff. Calhoun says we will not. We want to nullify the tariff. I should put down this was the nullification crisis. So that's important. And the nullification crisis was resolved by Henry Clay, who compromised and gradually lowered the tariff rate. Jackson also is a harsh critic of the Native Americans, had Congress pass the Indian Removal Act, which led to the Trail of Tears. And then the good old bank war, and that was with Henry Clay as well. Jackson was against the bank, and sorry about that, and had the Secretary of the Treasury remove all the funds from the bank and put the money into state banks. You may recall he had to actually dismiss several Treasury secretaries. Any chance, Hardeep, you know which Treasury secretary actually agreed to remove the money from the bank and put it into state banks? I'll give you a second. This gives people time to catch up to write all of this, I guess. And the answer is Roger Taney, Taney. I'll give you a second chance here. Do you happen to know what Roger Taney later did that was not related to being the Treasury Secretary? That is right. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision. All right, people watching this in... Okay, so what's the bank war? That's the question. So basically, Henry Clay supports the bank. Nicholas Biddle, bank president. They support the bank. They like the idea of a national bank. Jackson did not. Alyssa Jackson personally just didn't trust banks. He had lost money in banks, was not confident in the bank's ability to keep people's money. So he even once said, the bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it first. So he vetoed the bank. He said, we're not going to extend having this bank. And then took the money out of the banks and put the money into state banks. Those state banks got nicknames as pet banks. Does that help with the bank war? And okay, good. I can't even tell you the challenge it is to review because I want to spend hours talking about this, but I'm just giving you the big picture here. All right. Now this second great awakening that seems to befuddle so many of us. All right, let's first, I know what the question's going to be. What's the first great awakening? So you got to go all the way back to the 1730s, colonial times, when the first great awakening was led by Jonathan Edwards, and they were trying to scare people into being more religious. All right, so the second great awakening is slightly different. Most of it originated in upstate New York, in Rochester. They called it the burned over district. And it was just the growth of new religions. So I did tell you about the Mormons. So the question, the first one, it scared people, the first great awakening, that if you don't become religious, that you're going to go to hell. So the sermon was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And it was an attempt to get people to be more religious because the third generation in the colonies didn't have the same religious fervor. Does that help you out? Sounds good. Some of us need a little bit of help in the typing department. Okay, so the burned over district is where the second great awakening originates, religious movement, but there are other things going on. I know that most of the classes, we did not learn about the Transcendentalists yet, so I think that and the Whigs tomorrow are going to be the beginning of class. But that was a literary group and a philosophical group that was challenging certain aspects of society and connecting with nature. But I promise I'll do that. I'll do that tomorrow. These utopian communities are, I can't look because people make me laugh. These utopian communities were the ones, the Shakers, Oneida, and then Hardeep, you have your little socialist one, New Harmony. And these are the ones that are just trying to perfect society, very disappointed with the way America was at the time. The more traditional reforms that you should know, the abolitionist movement is during this time. The temperance movement, that is the movement to ban alcohol, is during this time. And the women's rights movement is during this time. I think I did another slide on that. I did. So the women's movement, Seneca Falls Convention was 1848. That's the beginning of the women's rights movement. Abolitionist movement, please remember that there were slave revolts during this time. I know I taught you about Nat Turner as one of them. I definitely know we talked about William Lloyd Garrison. He was the very radical white abolitionist who burned a copy of the Constitution. And Frederick Douglass, who was a black man who escaped slavery, became one of the leading intellectual minds of this time period, and did work with the suffragist as well. There was a whole combination at the time. I should have put Sojourner Truth's name up here. Sorry about that. I guess I have to work on my typing skills as well. Sojourner Truth. Her famous speech was "Ain't I a Woman?" So they could use that as a document. And just be aware that the Irish potato famine led to mass immigration of Irish people to America during the 1840s, and they did not get well received here. So you have the rise of the Know Nothing Party, which was anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-foreigner, and that is what the word nativism means. Nativists are fearful of foreigners. So Hardeep, do you think I missed anything specific? I feel like we did that nicely, actually. I don't know if I had my same energy, but but I definitely think we covered what's a little bit of a challenging time period. And then the next one, I'm just going to rock and roll because that's Civil War Reconstruction. So I can't wait. All right. So we're all good. I know the people that are not with us can't wait for me to stop talking so they can just move on. But time period 4 is done. Until tomorrow, time period 5. It was great seeing you guys. I have to run off to a basketball game and finish my paper and do all those things. So enjoy the rest of your Sunday. And all right, thanks a lot. I'll see you guys tomorrow.